Hello and welcome to this Autistic sales video which will explain what autism is and discuss whether all of our alters are autistic. For people new to our videos, we are diagnosed with both autism and dissociative identity disorder, or DID. DID is the presence of more than one personality or self within a person and is discussed in more detail in other videos on our channel. This video is going to be focusing more on autism and considering how it is determined if a person is autistic, and discussing whether all of the selves that make up autistic selves are autistic. If you haven't already subscribed to our channel, then please subscribe by clicking the button below and turn on notifications to be the first to see our new videos. This is the sensory-friendly version of our video and will not contain any music or sound effects. We will start by defining what autism means to us. We define autism as a social and communication difference. Autism is a difference in processing. We see the world differently. When were we diagnosed as being autistic? We received a very late diagnosis of autism. We weren't diagnosed until 2018 when we were 42 years old. How were we diagnosed as autistic? We were diagnosed by a specialist speech and language therapist and a psychiatrist. They used the criteria in the DSM-5. This was the official manual used for classifying and diagnosing mental disorders at the time of our diagnosis. It is published by the American Psychiatric Association. The American Psychiatric Association has recently revised the DSM-5. The revised version is called DSM-5-TR, where the TR stands for text revision. In terms of the criteria for autism, this largely remains the same, but they have clarified how the reference text defines autism to make it clearer. Specifically, it states that all of the criteria in Section A must be present, not just one. It is our understanding that clinicians were already only given a diagnosis when all the criteria were being met in any case, so this revision is just clarifying what professionals were already doing. What are the diagnostic criteria for an autism diagnosis? We are going to outline the diagnostic criteria for autism in the DSM-5-TR and then give examples from our assessment report as to why we meet the criteria for a diagnosis of autism. According to the DSM-5-TR, to meet the diagnostic criteria for ASD, a person must have persistent deficits in each of 3 areas of social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, and at least 2 types of restricted and repetitive behaviours. The DSM-5-TR lists examples of behaviours that might be seen in each of these 3 areas. We are going to quote the examples given and then discuss examples from our own autism assessment report, which shows why we meet the criteria for diagnosis. But first, a disclaimer. The language used in the DSM-5-TR is medical and not the language we would choose to use, but we are using it because we feel it is important to quote directly from the DSM-5-TR when explaining the criteria. We prefer to use positive, less medical language when describing autism. For example, we see autism as a difference rather than a deficit. According to the DSM-5-TR, a person must meet all 3 of the criteria in Section A to be diagnosed with autism. These are deficits in social emotional reciprocity, deficits in non-verbal communicative behaviours, and deficits in developing, maintaining and understanding relationships. Examples of deficits in social emotional reciprocity include failure of normal back and forth conversation and failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. We met the criteria for this section as even though on the surface we can appear to hold conversations and interact in a conventional way, we have actually learned all these skills through observing others. Communicating with others is also highly fatiguing and draining for us, mainly because we are masking rather than being our true selves. Our report also said that we struggled to pick up on hints and were over-inclusive in our style of communication. We would argue that this is just because our brain works in a more detailed and focused way. We give more information than others need, but equally, they don't give us enough information. The DSM-5-TR lists the following examples of deficits in non-verbal communicative behaviours used for social interaction. Poorly integrated verbal and non-verbal communication, abnormalities in eye contact and body language. Our assessment report states that our gestures and facial expressions are not always integrated with our spoken language. We have learned how to make expressions, rather than this coming naturally to us, and often people misunderstand and misinterpret us. The third aspect which must be present for an autism diagnosis is deficits in developing, maintaining and understanding relationships. Examples given in the DSM-5 TR include difficulties adjusting behaviour to suit various social contexts and difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends. We meet the criteria for this section as we have always struggled with making and maintaining friendships. As a child, we needed to have another child look after us and tell us what to do and how to play. As an adult, we struggle with knowing what to talk about and can often offend people without intending to. To be diagnosed as autistic, a person must meet all the criteria we have just described from Section A, and also needs to meet at least 2 out of 4 examples given in Section B. Section B describes restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities which must be manifested by at least 2 of the following currently or by history. Criterion B1 refers to stereotyped or repetitive speech, motor movements or use of objects. We prefer to call this stimming. Criterion B2 refers to excessive adherence to routines, ritualised patterns of verbal or non-verbal behaviour, or excessive resistance to change. We prefer to call this a preference for sameness. Criterion B3 refers to highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. We prefer to refer to this as having a special interest. Criterion B4 refers to hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. We prefer to call this a difference in sensory processing. We are going to explain why we meet the criterion for Section B using examples from our assessment report and our everyday life. We meet the criteria for Criterion B1, which refers to repetitive movements or stimming. Here is an example of our favourite fidget toy. Moving the blocks backwards and forwards helps us to focus and relax, as well as ground us. We meet the criteria for Criterion B2, which refers to a need for sameness and dislike of change. We have always found change difficult and struggle with transitions. We meet the criteria for Criterion B3, which refers to highly restricted fixated interests or special interests. We get very fixated and intensely focused on our interests. We have lots of special interests, including cats, reading, running, and art. We meet the criteria for Criterion B4, which refers to hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input, or having sensory differences. We are very sensitive to noise and to bright lights. Loud, repetitive noises trigger a headache in us. As well as meeting all of the criteria in Section A, and at least 2 of the criteria in Section B, a person must also meet the criteria in Section C, D, and E in order to be diagnosed with autism. Criterion C states that symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies in later life. We meet the criteria for Criterion C. We always had difficulties, but naturally masked and covered them up until we could no longer do so. Criterion D states that symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. We meet the criteria for Criterion D. Although we are a qualified speech and language therapist, we are currently unable to work because of our difficulties. Criterion E states that these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability. We meet the criteria for Criterion E as we do not have an intellectual disability. So to summarise, to be diagnosed with autism, a person must have all 3 types of social interaction and communication difficulties, 2 types of restricted and repetitive behaviours. The difficulties must have been present since birth, even though they may not have been noticed until later on in life. The difficulties must impact on daily life, and the difficulties shouldn't be better explained by intellectual disability. What are our feelings about how autism is defined in the DSM? We don't feel comfortable with the way the DSM describes autism. We feel all the descriptions are very negative in focus and ignore the many positive aspects of autism. We also feel uncomfortable with autism being in the DSM in the first place because we don't consider autism to be a mental health disorder. In fact, we don't consider it to be a disorder at all. We feel it is a brain difference and a natural variation in human diversity. We also feel that the many positives associated with being autistic could be used to diagnose autism. For example, autistic people are often able to see the world in great detail and often have very logical brains. However, currently, in 2022, autism is diagnosed using deficit-based criteria and focuses on an autistic person's difficulties rather than their strengths. We hope that this might change in the future. In part 2 of our video, we are going to be considering whether all of our personas are autistic. At the time of our autism diagnosis in 2018, we had integrated all of our alters, and so it was actually only Naomi who was assessed. After we were diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, or DID, in 2004, we began to work together in becoming one person. We believed that the only way to live a normal life was as one person. We now know that this belief wasn't true. It is possible to have alters and still lead a full life. Nevertheless, total integration, or final fusion, was our goal, and in our therapy the alters fused with each other one by one until, in 2006, we were left with just one personality, Naomi. Naomi went on to have her own family. After her children were diagnosed as autistic, she realised that she too was autistic and sought her own assessment. Although we discussed our past diagnosis of DID with the clinicians that assessed us, at the time of our assessment no alters were present, and this was really more of an intellectual discussion. Naomi wondered if she had ever truly had alters at all, or if she had just divided her life into compartments in order to cope. This annoyed the alters, who were still inside but not accessible. We now see ourselves as having not truly integrated. Our alters had just gone very deep inside us, so deep that they appeared to have gone. Our alters were hiding, rather than having truly integrated. Shortly after our autism diagnosis, the alters began to emerge, beginning with Julie, until eventually all the alters had returned, and the question of whether we had ever really had DID was answered for us. Very obviously we did have DID in 2004, and we continue to do so today. So officially, only Naomi has actually been diagnosed as being autistic, although theoretically she would have contained all the alters within her. So theoretically, if she is autistic, then her alters must be too. However, we still find it useful to consider whether all of our personas are autistic in their own right, as each alter has their own age, personal history and memory, name, voice and interests. It could be that some alters are autistic and others aren't. The problem with this idea is that although alters feel like they are separate people, they actually aren't. Our reality is that we all share the same body and the same brain. None of us can live our own separate lives. We all have to learn to live together, and we have to share our time. We all share a brain, so given that autism is a brain difference, it would make sense that if one of us is autistic, then all of us would be autistic. Some alters definitely appear to have better social understanding and better social skills than others. For example, Winifred, Caroline, Fiona and Dina are better able to interact with others in the world, although even they will get drained and exhausted from too much social interaction and need time to recover from the experience. Our teenage and young adult alters haven't developed the same level of theory of mind as the older alters, and they struggle to understand another person's point of view. In fact, they struggle to even care about another person's point of view, even if they did understand it. Some alters are too young to really be able to tell whether they are autistic or not. Although as autism is present from birth, if we are autistic, then they are also likely to be autistic. Tina, or Tiny, is our youngest daughter and is a pre-verbal baby of around 6 months. She can only communicate in gurgles, but has a connection to Charlotte and can communicate with us a little via her. Charlotte varies in age from around 2 years up to around 4 years. Charlotte often pops out, especially when she is upset, and will need to be comforted by Fiona. Charlotte seems to us to be autistic and to not really understand other people. She finds the world confusing and is extremely sensitive to the sounds, smells and sights around her. She cries a lot and appears to have 2 main emotions, sadness and happiness, which she jumps between abruptly, and we often don't know what has triggered her. We also have personas that are non-human, a cat, a robot and a tree. It's hard to see how they could be diagnosed as autistic. So to summarise and answer our question, are all our personas autistic? We would say that most, if not all of us, are autistic. As autism is a difference in brain function and we all share the same body and the same brain, we feel that it is likely that all of us have the same neurotype, even if it isn't possible to formally assess each one of us. Thank you for watching our video. If you haven't already, then please subscribe to our channel. If you can afford to do so, then please consider making a small donation to us via our designated fundraising page. All donations go directly to us and help us continue our work. Thank you for your support from everyone at Autistic Selves.